Well, hello xenographers everywhere and welcome to another episode. The more I use the 85mm focal length, the more I like it. It's got more reach than a 50mm lens, but it's not too long. There's more background blur available and more subject separation at longer distances. It's a good focal length for portraits, and many 85mm lenses are relatively small, only slightly bigger than the average fast 50mm. All of which to say, I've found it a very useful focal length indeed. Today we're going to look at three 85mm vintage lenses from Olympus, Pentax and Nikon. They all have a unique character and they'll all make images with a unique look and feel. As usual, all the images in this video are shot on the full frame Sony A7 Mark I. The first of today's lenses is the 85mm f2 from Olympus, made for the OM camera system, and like all the OM lenses, this one is beautifully made. It's entirely metal with no plastic components. It's magnificently engineered. The focus ring on this one is as silky smooth as the day it left the factory, and it has a focus throw of about 180 degrees with a minimum focus distance of 85 centimeters. The aperture ring moves cleanly and precisely, and aperture values run from f2 to f16, and this lens has 8 aperture blades. Wide open at f2, this lens is already very sharp. In fact, it's one of the sharpest vintage lenses I've shot wide open. I think the Zeiss Jenner Pancolar might just beat it, but only by a whisker. Sharpness is so good that stopping down doesn't seem to change it much, and it seems more or less as sharp at f2 as it is at smaller apertures. That's not to say there's no increase in sharpness as you stop down, and shooting test charts would probably reveal it, but in real-world photography, to my eye at least, it's just not there. What this means is that, unlike many other lenses, you can get near maximum sharpness and maximum blur simultaneously, and separation of subject from background, unless you're shooting at very long distances, is pretty much guaranteed, and that's particularly useful for subjects like portraits, where maximum separation is often required. This lens, like many OM lenses, has very strong contrast, and it makes strong, bold and punchy images in both colour and black and white. Images from this lens have a resonance and a depth, and that high contrast level works with its inherent sharpness to create strong and striking images. With a strong light source in the frame, most of the time this lens behaves itself well, which speaks well for the quality of its coatings. However, on rare occasions and at certain angles, reflections from glass elements appear, which lowers contrast significantly. A lens hood or shading the lens with your hand will reduce the effect. Fully open, there's some quite heavy vignetting, and although it's most noticeable when testing for vignetting rather than in general shooting, nevertheless it's there. Stopping down to f4 reduces it almost to nothing, and by f8 it completely disappears. In the tradition of the OM Zuiko lenses, this one has stunning colours, high in saturation and definition. This lens loves colour, and it paints them big and bold. Having said that, they're not as saturated as some, the Minolta Rocco 58mm 1.4 for example, or the Helios 40 85mm f1.5, but I think the Zuiko lenses strike a better balanced colour profile, stepping back before the point where colours might seem too intense. It seems to be a fairly cool lens, emphasising the blue end of the spectrum. For my taste, that's just right. I'm not too keen on images that seem over warm, but if the cool look isn't to your taste, you can warm it up with a custom white balance. Because this is a fast, longish lens, there's plenty of background blur available, both when you're shooting up close and at longer distances. The character of the blur is very pleasing too. It's big and soft at the minimum focus distance of 85 centimeters. But the real test for blur comes as camera, subject and background distances change relative to each other, which is when harshness and nervousness in the blur are often seen, which can detract from the image. That's not the case with this lens though, because whatever you do with it, however you change the relationship between camera, subject and background, blur never becomes unpleasant. It changes for sure in intensity and in character, and it does become less smooth, but it never acquires the harsh, jittery, nervous feel that can emerge in other lenses, and it never detracts from a shot. This one is lovely all the way. As for price, well, this lens seems to go for around £200 to £250, which might seem expensive, but this is a very accomplished lens with extremely high performance. It's not the cheapest 85mm lens, but it is, in my opinion at least, one of the best. And from that perspective, this lens has got to be good value. Our next lens is the super multi-coated Takumar 85mm f1.8 from Pentax, and it's another beautifully made all-metal lens. It's a bit longer than the Olympus, and it's quite a bit wider. It's heavier too, and altogether it's a slightly heftier bit of kit. The engineering on these Takumars is exquisite, and you can feel that when you use them. The focus ring on this one is beyond silky smooth. Minimum focus distance is the same as the Olympus at 85 centimeters, and the focus throw is about 3/4 of a turn. The aperture ring turns freely and smoothly with half stops for all values except between f11 and f16. Aperture values run from f16 to f1.8, so it's slightly faster than the Olympus, but not by much. And this lens has 10 aperture blades. This is another very sharp lens that, like the Olympus, gives a sharply defined image, even wide open. And that's true right across the frame, corners and sides included. Again, like the Olympus, it's so sharp wide open that stopping down brings only a barely perceptible improvement. Depth of field changes, of course, but sharpness doesn't, at least not by much. So this too is a lens that will give you maximum background blur, should that be what you want, together with almost maximum sharpness, and a crisp, clean separation of subject from background is pretty much guaranteed, even at longer distances. It would be difficult to say which is the sharper lens too. In real-world photography, it's very hard to put a hair between them, so I'm going to declare the Olympus and the Pentax lenses equally sharp. There's some fairly heavy vignetting wide open, and corners and sides are significantly darkened. In fact, they're darker than in the shot from the Olympus, and although they're not darker by much, the Olympus definitely scores a point here. I think it's a bit darker at f4 as well, although by f8 vignetting disappears completely. Contrast is strong on this lens, and it seems about equal to the Olympus. Images are strong and punchy, crisp and clean, with good body and depth. Contrast does wash out if there's a light source at the right angle in the frame, but it resists it very well indeed. It happens very infrequently, and when it does happen, contrast washes out only by a very small amount, and much less than the Olympus. Pentax lenses I've used in the past have shared a distinct look when it comes to colour, medium saturation, with a gentle, delicate, almost a pastel rendering of colour. This lens, however, seems to take a different approach. It's bolder and more direct, much less restrained, Colours are solid and strong, intense and powerful. It's a very different look to the Olympus and very much a defining factor of this lens. It's a difficult choice, but on balance, I prefer the colours from the Pentax. It's a fantastic lens for black and white too. Images are crisp, smart and clean with outstanding contrast and a very broad range of tones. Here again, I think the images from the Pentax are marginally nicer than those from the Olympus. If you're a blur junkie, this lens will not disappoint. It'll give you plenty of background blur even at longer distances, thanks to its longish focal length and fast f1.8 aperture. Up close to the subject, blur is of course considerable and very smooth. Forms and shapes melt away completely, leaving a big blurry wash. And as camera, subject and background distances change, that smoothness remains. Whatever you do to it and however you change those distances, this lens cannot be phased and background blur remains smooth. In fact, I think it's a little smoother than the Olympus and a little bit nicer too. The difference is a subtle one and it's difficult to put my finger on it, but there's just something about the blur from this lens that feels nice. A definite win for the Pentax. With regard to cost, well, these lenses seem to go for a little more than the Olympus, around £250 to £300, but considering the beauty and the unique character of the images it makes, I think that's fantastic value. And if you've got money saved to buy lenses, I can't think of a better one to spend it on. Finally today, we have the Nikon Nikkor AI 85mm f2, and this lens too is very solidly made. Like many 70s lenses, it's all metal with no plastic parts used in its construction. The focus ring turns smoothly, but not quite as smoothly as it did when it left the factory. There is a very slight resistance, and ideally this one could do with a service. Minimum focus distance is 85 centimeters and the focus throw is about 3/4 of a turn. The aperture ring moves cleanly with full click stops between values. Apertures run from f2 to f22 and this lens has 7 aperture blades. Wide open, this lens shows good sharpness and as long as you nail focus accurately, it will deliver high levels of detail. And in this real-world test, sharpness seems about the same as the Pentax and the Olympus. Stopping down to f4 does sharpen up the image, and there's clearly a slightly greater level of resolution. Stopping down further doesn't seem to change things much, and I couldn't see any difference between f4 and f8. Shooting test charts might reveal subtle variations, but in real-world photography, f4 seems like the sweet spot for this one. Unsurprisingly, it vignettes wide open and corners and sides show quite significant darkening. Although not quite to the same degree as the Pentax and the Olympus, this lens is slightly better in this regard. Stopping down to f4 reduces darkening, although it is still there, more so than the Olympus and the Pentax at this point. Stop down to f8 though, and it disappears completely. This lens has good contrast and it makes strong and punchy images, although contrast generally isn't quite as strong as that from either the Pentax or the Olympus lenses. It's not a low contrast lens as such, but it doesn't have quite the pep, quite the sparkle that the others do. It's also rather more prone to washing out with a light source in the frame. It seems easier to catch light in a way that degrades the image, and when contrast does drop, it drops by quite a bit. There are no reflections from internal elements, just a general haziness that's easily fixed in post, but using a lens hood while you're shooting will stop it happening in the first place. This is another cool lens, emphasizing the blue end of the spectrum rather than the red. It has a very distinctive color signature that I've noticed several AI lenses share. There's plenty of saturation and colors are painted big, bright and bold. Colours are exuberant, but there's a delicacy too, a restraint and a subtlety that lends a certain calmness to images. There's a balance to this lens that means its strong colours never become overpowering. Being a fast, longish lens, we can expect an abundance of background blur, and for the most part its blur is well behaved. Shooting close to the subject, blur is massive and super soft, and as camera, subject and background distances change, although blur diminishes, it's well controlled. Most of the time it's smooth and pleasing, although occasionally it does show some harshness, which does detract from a shot and makes it less pleasing than it might otherwise be. It's easy to shoot around by varying distances slightly, and for the most part, blur from this lens is very nice indeed. As far as prices go, this lens seems to go for around £80 to £100, and for a fast lens with good sharpness and great colour rendition that does almost as much as the more expensive lenses here, I would suggest that's quite a bargain. So, 3 fantastic fast 85s, each of which will make some beautiful images, each of which has a unique aesthetic look. I suggest you try one. None of them will disappoint. So, that's it from me for now. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring that bell before you go, and if you'd like to support this channel and help it to grow and develop, you can do that at patreon.com/Zenography. As ever, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time for some more Zenography.